Hi, I'm Izzy. I'm a palaeo-technician at Neo Jurassica, but I came into paleontology through actually studying a zoology degree. So I began all my education studying modern animals, and as part of that, I also did a placement year at Bristol Zoological Society where I studied field conservation science. So through being involved in a lot of their conservation projects and a lot of their ecological surveys, I became super interested in how we can protect the UK and just native animals and kind of prioritise the lesser processed land and how we can really keep Britain at its roots and how we can help those native animals kind of survive the best in their habitats. So what is rewilding? So it's essentially a holistic, large-scale restoration of environments that allow nature to eventually stabilise and take care of itself. It basically doesn't need any human intervention and just allows nature to do what it does best and allow it to drive itself towards goals. There are some key principles of rewilding. So this is me and my course mates doing some habitat restoration and hitting each other with some tree guards in Bristol. So initially, it kind of looks at supporting people and nature. We all know that being outdoors has humongous, not only physical, but mental benefits. So it's about letting people get out into nature and letting us reconnect with where we would have originally been with our ancestors pretty much 24/7. And it also allows us to look at it from a wider community sense and get people involved in it on a larger scale. So we also want to prioritise letting nature lead rewilding. So we want to really reinstate natural processes and regeneration of species within their own habitats with minimal human intervention. So this isn't aimed at any human-defined goal. This is about letting nature drive itself to the process and state of which it wants to stabilise and stay. We also want to look at creating economic return from rewilding so that the government can prioritise these processes as something that will benefit them and bring in money through the financial enterprises we can create. So it's essentially looking at creating nature-based businesses and economies. This photo here is kelp harvesting through a company called Seagrown, and that basically just looks at different uses for kelp for materials for creating different crafts, and just as a raw material that can be used, and that creates jobs and different areas of sectors for volunteers and just gives back to the community so that we can prioritise it as something that does benefit us but without using it for things that further our goals as a species and our existence in that kind of way. And this is another example that you kind of might have seen on places like Airbnb and kind of on the internet is people build wilderness retreats in very rural, under-processed areas in order to get the public to pay to spend time in those areas. Then that can be used to go back into further developing and helping rewild those areas. So it's about creating motivation to spend money and create economies in nature in the UK. So we also want to prioritise working at nature scale. So it's essentially just allowing nature to take us in the direction that we want without us trying to do anything to it and just leaving it to its own devices. We want to really create sustainable long-term processes that can thrive without us doing anything to them. So yeah, we want to secure these benefits for the long term. We want to leave a legacy and something that can be seen by future generations to motivate people to want to take care of our planet. It's no secret that we're kind of in a climate crisis at the minute. So this is about securing processes and creating frameworks that can be upheld by future generations and also sustain populations of animals in the future as well as just now. So why do we need to rewild, not only just in the UK, but globally? So the Anthropocene is a very common term that's chucked around now, the era of the humans and how we're manipulating our environment. So an increase in human industrialization and populations has led to mass habitat loss and fragmentation for native species globally. And because of the movement of people and things like trade and boats and planes and importing different flora and fauna, we've also had the introduction of non-native invasive species as well, which has caused competition for native species and in a lot of cases outcompeted them and caused detrimental impacts to them in their home country. We've also seen a massive production of waste, pollution and carbon emissions, which are obviously causing massive fluctuations in weather, temperature and things which animals simply cannot adapt to survive at the rate in which they are happening. It's far faster than anything can adapt to survive. So COP26 is obviously a climate conference that occurs regularly, and it's recognised that in order to meet net carbon zero, we need to really, really kind of reform the approaches we're taking to creating a greener and more climate resilient economy. So Rewilding Britain, which is kind of the leading branch in the UK for rewilding. Rewilding Europe is kind of the bigger picture, obviously in Europe, are calling for nature's recovery to be put at the heart of the economy. So really looking at things like building nature-driven economies for economic return and really seeing a driving force for this to be prioritised. So these are just some examples of non-native invasive species in the UK. So the signal crayfish is really outcompeting the native white claw crayfish, and they breed much faster and really downgrade ecosystems by burrowing behaviours in riverbanks. Himalayan balsam is really pretty, but it's really just awful for the planet. It spreads and grows really rapidly, so it outcompetes a lot of other plants. And when it spreads seeds, it literally explodes, so it can spread up to 7 meters per plant. So it's really hard to kind of control and eradicate once it gets started as well. And then there's also the Asian hornet, which poses a huge threat to the UK's native pollinators. It preys directly on bumblebees and other pollinators, and because they're quite big and scary looking, it also just deters them from pollinating or going near plants as well. So these are just some examples of things that we have essentially brought here through trade and movement of goods. So we also see, through the increase of people, we see an increased hunting on UK natives keystone species. We'll get into what a keystone species is in just a little bit, but this is some commonly known species that once were native to the UK and really thrived in our ecosystem. And this is what we're left with currently. So it's not really looking very good. And this is all due to overhunting and exhaustion of habitat and resources in the native ecosystem, essentially. So why should we rewild Britain? Rewilding our land removes carbon out of the air and stores it in trees, peat and other habitats. So natural regeneration and letting trees self-seed rather than, we see a lot of movements of people planting trees to increase photosynthesis and oxygen in the atmosphere, which is great. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But letting it be done naturally allows plants to naturally grow and store carbon within them and removing it from the atmosphere, and thus increasing oxygen in the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Healthy and species-rich grasslands cover over 30% of our land, and if they're rewilded, that can store up to 53 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. So there's a huge positive benefit to allowing this to happen. And so at the top, that's just a typical Scottish marsh peatland, and they're really, really diverse. These things house a massive repertoire of invertebrates especially, but also amphibians and grasses and just loads and loads of different species at all different levels of a food web. And then this is an example of natural generation at the bottom for the Black Jaguar Foundation. So they kind of kickstart rewilding, and then it's about leaving it to do what it wants to do. Rewilding our seas also helps us remove massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, and this is known as blue carbon. So when we see bottom trawling and different like mining underwater for fossil fuels and stuff as well, this disturbs a huge amount of carbon, which is then released out into the atmosphere. And so maintaining kelp and seagrass meadows basically allows them to absorb that carbon through photosynthesis and store it in the ocean and keep it locked in there. So it's really important that we maintain these populations in the ocean as well. And reintroducing missing species also helps facilitate carbon cycling and storage. As I said, we'll get onto keystone species in a minute, but these are super, super important to allowing the fundamental basics of different ecosystems to function as they want to and function naturally. So a really good example of this is Pacific sea otters in Alaska. When we see the removal of sea otters, sea urchins massively increase in their population and they consume sea kelp. And when sea kelp decreases, we see a massive decrease in biodiversity and abundance of different fish which feed off that sea kelp. So when the otter numbers increase, it's actually super, super good for kelp numbers, and then in turn locking carbon as well into the kelp as it grows. So rewilding also helps mitigate extreme weather. such as flooding and wildfires. So really focusing on healthy water retaining soils and like peatlands and marshes in the UK, basically does exactly what it says on the tin and keeps ground wet and stops it from drying out to the point where it can, where things can set on fire. We see a lot of fires worldwide and forest fires occurring where it simply gets too dry, and we see lots of grasses catching fire in the UK mostly as well. So this would really help reduce that as a risk. We also use the reintroduction of beavers, which I've realised I've spelt beavers on the slide, which is not what they're called. Beavers are fantastic ecological engineers, essentially. So the creation of dams by them helps mitigate water flow, so it can help stop flooding, and also what we call re-wiggle the flow of water in rivers to help direct it away and in a natural flow rather than bursting banks and things like that. So it's really, really cool, and the effects that rewilding can do is super widespread. And in linking to that as well, it also helps wildlife adapt and survive to climate change. We're simply at a point where human intervention has exhausted wildlife, so now we need human intervention to set it on the right path again, to help it reinstate itself and allow biodiversity to kind of restabilise and thrive again in the UK. So rewilding key areas and reducing habitat fragmentation allows wildlife corridors to be made, so we can allow the movement of animals through habitats where they'd rather thrive, and that allows populations to grow and also reduces competition in smaller habitats between other species at the same trophic level. So, for example, creating connected habitats, if you've got multiple deer species, they're not all then trying to eat the same thing. They can move more and allows them to just occupy more space. So what are keystone species? We mentioned them a little bit with beavers and with otters. So keystone species are a specific animal that if it is removed from its ecosystem, the ecosystem essentially breaks. It will either cause complete ecological collapse, or it will have to completely fundamentally function differently altogether. And the kind of idea of keystone species were identified independently by 5 different ecologists in the 1990s, I believe. And the first one they kind of identified that was really kind of shocking was the wildebeest. So the wildebeest suffered for decades due to disease, and the population was kind of stuck at about 250,000. Once the disease was bred out of the population, they rose in numbers and stabilised at about 1.4 million. When you've got a massive grazer like this, you look at it and you kind of think, oh my God, increased numbers of that, what is that going to do to vegetation populations? Is it going to completely exhaust our native flora? But they actually saw the complete opposite. Because they were eating grass, it reduced burning on wildfires, and it also allowed for trees to grow in space of that grass, and that provided food for other animals at the same kind of trophic level and above, so giraffes, elephants, and more homes for birds. And then the production of more bark allows for different animals to graze and do bark stripping. So they were a really, really amazing kind of underdog for rewilding and as a keystone species as well. And then this just kind of describes the flow of the otter and these are the sea urchins. And you can see like they breed super quickly. So when you kind of get a population, they just completely take over underwater kelp and seagrass ecosystems. So on the left, you can see how if otters are absent, urchins increase, kelp goes down, fish species go down, ecosystem biodiversity goes down. And then the presence of sea otters is the complete contrary. And they're very cute, which helps as well. So these are an example of trophic cascades within an ecosystem as well. So trophic cascades are essentially when the reintroduction of that keystone species affects all levels, all trophic levels within an ecosystem. So trophic levels, just in case you aren't aware, are kind of at the bottom we've got producers, so the plants of which the first level of herbivores consume. So we've got primary consumers, above that is secondary consumers, and it goes all the way up to kind of apex predators, which obviously are carnivores within an ecosystem. So the Yellowstone wolves were a really, really amazing example of this. So in the 1920s, the government actually allowed a policy to exterminate the apex predator from Yellowstone National Park in the US, which I can't really imagine why you would do that, but they didn't really foresee the impacts clearly. And this caused a massive trophic cascade as they were a keystone species. So elk populations exploded, which caused overgrazing of willows and aspen. And then beavers disappeared because they prioritised these types of trees to build their dams. And then coyotes became an apex predator, which reduced other herbivore populations that wouldn't normally be targeted by wolves. And then in 1995, they kind of thought, this is getting a bit out of hand. What will happen if we put them back where they're meant to be? So in 1995, the Endangered Species Act basically allowed the reintroduction of them back into their original habitat. Elk numbers dropped and riparian vegetation increased, and that's the vegetation which is between kind of stable grassland and rivers, so that really rich kind of diverse vegetation area. And in some habitats, like in Alberta in Canada, that supports like 95% of their diversity, the riparian zones. So it's super important to all different levels of an ecosystem. Beaver colonies also increased from 1 to 12. So the introduction of wolves has really kind of re-put nature back into balance, and rewilding has really just allowed it to do what it does best on its own. And even here you can see the figure between the diversity and abundance of different vegetation over 13 years. And then again, same kind of diagram as with the otter. So the red lines, the solid lines are the direct effects, and the dotted lines are the indirect effects. So by them directly controlling coyote and elk populations, we're indirectly massively benefiting pronghorns, small mammals, stream morphology by the woody plants growing more, and then the beavers, etc., etc. So they're really, really vital to the ecosystem and keeping it all in balance in Yellowstone. So we do also, as I mentioned, have British keystone species. But there are some that, due to extinction and other factors, are not so feasible for reintroduction and rewilding. So one of them is the wild boar. So this went extinct in the 13th century due to overhunting and control to protect crops. Pigs are really nosy. They like to dig around. They're fantastic for carbon cycling because they root around for tubers and other different vegetation to eat. But due to security reasons and threats from their behaviour, they're really protective of their young. So they're not really feasible to have reintroduced to the UK purely because they could be considered dangerous. But domestic species such as the Tamworth pig can play a really similar ecological role. And places like the Knepp Castle estate, which is a fantastic rewilding project, which essentially tries to incorporate missing species to allow it to rewild on its own, uses these pigs to carry out exactly the same kind of jobs. So other than just turning up soil, they create wallows, which is a great habitat for amphibians, dragonflies, and aquatic plants to breed and reproduce. And as I said, they plough the soil. But there is possibility for boars to come back, as they do have an economic return for their meat, and it's quite valuable. So there is a way to make it sustainable. It would just have to be quite controlled. But then it's like, what's the point? So yeah. The other one that isn't necessarily possible is the Eurasian wolf. So these went extinct in the 18th century following centuries of persecution in the UK. It was Britain's apex predator, and they are a keystone species. Like, as we said in the Yellowstone slide, they alter the behaviour and distribution of their prey species, primarily deer, through scenting and also just hunting as well. So they reduce overgrazing and support the re-establishment of woodlands and mosaic habitats, which are basically just super diverse, rich habitats that can support all different types of animals. And carcasses from wolf kills also help really create the soil to be nutrient dense, and just helps detritivores and allows for nutrient cycling and carbon cycling in the atmosphere as well. Quite frankly, society is not ready for the reintroduction of wolves. I don't think any of us would like to be driving through the peaks and see wolves running around at this point. So there's a lot of work to be done groundwork-wise and societally for wolves to be reintroduced into the UK. And there's also elk. So it looks like a moose. It's not a moose. It's a relative of the moose, but is kind of a moose. So these went extinct between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago due to overhunting. They're a major ecosystem engineer, just like beavers, and they catalyse the natural regeneration of vegetation, and also help control grasses by their grazing and trampling of open spaces. They help keep spaces clear, stop it from overgrowing too much. They're currently widespread in Scandinavia and Poland. They really, really love moist areas of deciduous forests, and they really, really thrive under seasonal snow cover. So quite frankly, the UK has changed to a climate now where it just cannot support them as a species. They really need temperatures below 27 degrees because they can't sweat. So they really need a climate that the UK currently just can't provide. But a similar species to this that's doing similar behaviours and controlling habitats in a similar way is red deer. So there is kind of that thing going on, but these can't be reintroduced to the UK. And there's also the aurochs. So this is globally extinct, and this is something that our very early human ancestors would have been hunting and killing. So this is what pretty much all modern cattle is derived from. We do see a lot of their characteristics in the Tauros, which is down here, and also in hardier species like the Highland cow and stuff like that. So they carry out very, very similar behaviours, like being habitual grazers, which enables wildflowers to coexist and compete with more boisterous grazers. So not one animal is consuming most of the vegetation, and make sure that different vegetation is targeted as well for consumption. And similar to the elk, they trample ground to make it bare, which allows for basking for insects and reptiles. So they're really, really good. And then we talk a lot about cows producing lots of methane, but if you take out that massive overpopulation of domestic cows, cattle dung is vital for highly specialised detritivores and fungi in the ecosystem as well. So moving on from that, there are species that can be reintroduced and used for gap fillers in the UK for rewilding. So one is the beaver, which are my favourites. So these were actually hunted to extinction in the UK in the 16th century for their fur and a natural secretion which is used in oils and perfumes and makeup. They build dams, dig canals and create dead wood. Their dams prevent soil eroded from fields being lost to sea, and it also allows for carbon to be trapped and water quality to be increased. It also mediates flooding by slowing water flow. We have wild beavers now in Argyll, Tayside and Devon, and the population in Argyll is actually the biggest, and they've been declared a native species. And they are incredibly, incredibly cute as well. So this is just an example of kind of all of the areas of the ecosystem that they affect. So you can see up there, downs trees are loved by woodpeckers, and there's also areas where they can create hiding for reptiles, and they help the production of riparian zone wildflowers and stuff as well. And these are all of the projects in the UK that are looking at introducing beavers. So it's quite a big focus, and are super, super, super good at managing their ecosystem. Then there's the Eurasian lynx, which is the next best alternative for a wolf that won't do as much damage to humans potentially as a wolf. So these went extinct in the UK 1,300 years ago due to overhunting and habitat loss. They survived the longest in Scotland, which is still the best candidate for their reintroduction. There's a conservation project called Links to Scotland, which is really focusing on making this happen. They shape the landscape by altering the behaviour of prey species, such as roe deer, much like wolves do. And again, their carcasses from hunting provide food for other species and fertilise the soil as it decays. Lynx have been reintroduced to Switzerland, Germany and Slovenia, so it's definitely possible, and it would help restore habitats and natural woodland and provide economic opportunities for local communities to do things like habitat restoration and also provide enrichment for them in their habitats. So whilst I worked at Bristol Zoo, we did volunteering at Wild Place Project, which is their sister site in South Gloucestershire, and they have a really, really cool exhibition / kind of using animal enclosures as kind of a journey through time. So you have a lot of native species that were once that were once native and keystone species in the UK, like wolverines, wolves, brown bears, and the Eurasian lynx. So it kind of takes you through time, and the enclosures end at the point in time where that animal would have become extinct. But it's all in ancient woodlands, so it's in the habitat that they would have naturally existed, because it's not been processed or altered at all by humans. So this is a really lovely photo of them through the microscope existing, and then you walk above their enclosures, so you're not really upsetting them at all. It's a really cool. I'd really recommend going down there if you can. And European bison are also a really cool rewilding project in the UK. So these neared extinction, but were saved by a zoo in Poland. The first wild bison were reintroduced in 2022 in Kent as part of the Wilder-Bleen project. And in late 2022, we actually had the first calf be born. So that's a really cool sign. When animals start breeding in rewilding projects, that's when you know you've kind of hit the nail on the head with all the things that it needs to be provided for, not only sustaining a population, but allowing future generations to be provided for as well. So here he is. He's very cute. I couldn't find anywhere if he has a name, but he's very, very sweet. And that was the matriarch of the herd. I think she was 15 years old, gave birth to a little bull. But yeah, it tells us that the project is being completely carried out as it should be, because the animals are not only feeling safe and not stressed in order to breed, but also that the habitat is providing them all of the nourishment and provisions that they need to sustain young as well. And then getting away from the kind of invertebrates, it's really important that we protect Britain's oceans as well. So seagrass and oysters play a huge role in, as we said, blue carbon and locking carbon underwater through providing food for fish, and allowing for photosynthesis to produce more oxygen in the atmosphere as well. So Rewilding are a really cool charity that are working to restore keystone species in Scottish waters. Native oysters were once really abundant in Argyll, and exploitation has essentially diminished the population. So they're working to reinstate the populations by translocation and also helping them breed and thrive in their habitat. Oyster beds are really important as well because they provide natural nurseries for fish, and they also filter suspended matter from the water, which improves water quality. So they're really important, not just for carbon locking, but also literally improving the health of their ecosystem. And seagrass is also a vital habitat for multiple marine species, and 95% of seagrass meadows have disappeared from UK waters. So that clearly is going to have quite a detrimental effect. So prioritising that and increasing those populations is vital to not only carbon locking, but also allowing to facilitate the biodiversity of species in UK seas as well. So Rewilding is actually Scotland's first community-led rewilding project. And this is what we mean by creating sustainable futures and natural economies, because it involves all levels of the local community. So it's about getting volunteers involved, academic institutions involved, and so people can really see the benefit of why rewilding is important to us, not as what we can gain from an environment, but what we can learn from an environment and how it can benefit us naturally without us having to exploit it. And this is the other projects amongst the UK that are working to conserve marine species. So these are purely marine projects, the ones that are in blue, and then the ones that are green are about improving water quality and like things like British waterways that link into the seas further out towards the coast. So how can you be involved in this? It's all very good talking about like what projects can do, but a lot of people want to know what to get involved, how to be involved. And I think we're kind of at a point where saying like donate money or recycle or shop zero waste and doing things that generally can help the environment is kind of a tone deaf approach to how expensive that can be for people and how inaccessible it can be for a lot of families. So it's all about finding ways that everyone within a community can get the most out of nature and be involved if they want to be. So you can get involved with your local wildlife trust. Things like simply visiting them do loads for their numbers, and that they can see that there's a demand for people to be out in nature and really get the most out of it. So I've just popped the Sheffield Wildlife Trust link up there, and they have things like outreach projects, places where you can go for walks that literally just have a cafe, and just showing numbers and support for those are really, really important. If you're able, you can also support by volunteering in outreach projects and ecological surveys, which is what these photos are from. So this is from a freshwater aquatic invertebrate survey. This is from a flora survey, and these two are from great crested newt surveys. And that's a really big male great crested newt at the bottom. They're really, really cool. So yeah, simply visiting your local green space and becoming familiar with the animals that are in your environment, and kind of understanding once you can see them, how they're interlinked with each other, and then the relationship that you can build with them and how much you can understand them better. That's kind of the first step, is getting out and kind of seeing what is in your local ecosystem and kind of building that relationship and rapport with nature yourself. And these are just some examples of rewilding projects in Sheffield that are nearby that you can visit if you fancy. So this is a much larger scale one. This is Burbage and Eastern Moors, which is literally just south of Sheffield. It's really big. It's 3,200 hectares, and it supports uplands, grassland, water, wetland and woodland habitats. And it's gorgeous. These are spring photos. And the key species they support are red deer, so grazers that can help mitigate competition for different plant resources. This is Sunart Fields, which is in the High Peak in Derbyshire. This is a much smaller one. It's 50 hectares and it started in 2020. So it's very much in the beginning of its rewilding journey. But this is a really, really cool one because they really engage with the local community and get schools in to do things like forest school. So it's about getting younger people in, and they essentially, I used to be a teaching assistant. I used to work on forest school, and they literally get kids in and they get to learn to make forest fires. They get to work with natural materials and kind of just play in natural ecosystems and get to see what's living in the environment in their local areas. So this is something that you can go and visit. You can go visit both of these if you feel like seeing what rewilding looks like in Sheffield and Derbyshire. And then I've just got some references, my materials for the lecture. And yeah, thank you for listening. Have you got any questions?